Welcome to IVF This, episode 28, Post-Traumatic Growth with Krista St. Germain. Welcome to IVF This. I'm your host, Emily Ginn. I'm a mother to two beautiful and feral boys. I'm married to my favorite person in the world. I'm a social worker, a life coach, and an IVF warrior. I'm here to teach you how to manage your mind and emotions during your IVF journey, to break free from anxiety and regain control of your life, even in the midst of infertility. I'm going to teach you to say IVF this to how we think about, talk about, and experience infertility. Let's go. Hello, my friends. I am super excited to bring you this episode. It's an interview that I do with a coach who is actually one of my mentors. So I'm going to share a really amazing story about how Krista actually was a part of building IVF This, completely unbeknownst to her. Krista St. Germain is a coach for widowed moms. Now, I know that doesn't even feel like it's remotely in the vein of infertility and IVF, but what she is a master of is post-traumatic growth. Now, I talk a lot about trauma, and I mentioned post-traumatic growth a couple of times in the episode, and I talk a little bit about it on my Instagram. But this week, we actually get to find out what post-traumatic growth is, what it means, and how can we incorporate, if we choose, post-traumatic growth into our infertility journey. I'm so excited, and I can't wait to hear what you guys think of this episode. As always, if there's an episode topic or something you would like me to cover, you can always email me at hello@ivfthiscoaching.com. I would love to hear from you. If you have feedback or anything that you want to share with me, I am always open at that email address. And I can't say this enough. I would love to hear from you. So enjoy this episode and have a beautiful week. All right, I am welcoming one of my favorite coaches of all time here today with me, Krista St. Germain. First of all, I love your name.
Thank you.
But also, please take a second and introduce yourself. I know that our work doesn't overlap a lot, but I want to give my audience a really good idea of the type of work that you do and what you focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I bet we'll see how the conversation goes, but I bet it overlaps more than we probably, have discovered so far. But yes, I'm Krista St. Germain, and I'm a master certified life coach. And primarily what I do is help widowed moms figure out how to love life again. So I got into this work because my husband died almost 5 years ago, 2016. And as, could be expected, I didn't see it coming. It completely kind of pulled the rug out from under me. And coaching, when I found it, was what really helped me change the whole trajectory of my life. Not only did it help me get back to, that life is going to be okay, but it helped me really go forward and, bounce forward, grow forward, start actually creating more of what I wanted in life. And I'm pretty sure why I'm here on the planet is to help other women do the same thing. So that's what I do.
So good. So just within the 2 minutes that you were introducing yourself, our work does overlap. It was a complete overstatement on my part because my work is completely dedicated to helping women love their life through infertility.
Yeah.
I talk a lot about grief and trauma in my work. Obviously, that's something that you touch on frequently. So yes, I love it. And I want to share kind of how I came to adore you and come to find you. Again, I'm so sorry. I'm going to fangirl all over you. It's totally fine.
You're very kind.
I was introduced to the Life Coach School with Brooke Castillo's podcast. She's the owner and creator of the coaching certification program that both you and I went through. And I was introduced with her about 2016. My sister-in-law called me and she was like, "Oh my God, you have to listen to this. Swear to God, it's like you're talking to me," which is now like one of the best compliments I've ever received in my entire life. And so when I was first introduced, within about 6 months, I was like, I could do this. So my background is I have a master's degree in social work and a master's degree in healthcare administration. So I had started going through my clinical certification to do counseling and therapy.
Yeah.
I was about 6 months into that, and my clinical supervisor was like, "Do you really want to do counseling?" I was like, "Oh, that's a hard pass. That's a hard no for me." And so she was like, maybe administrative work is more towards your speed. I was like, okay, that's great. Thank you very much for your work. I appreciate it. And so I was listening to Brooke, and the entire time I was like, I don't know, like my only exposure to coaching had been business coaching, weight loss, and executive coaching. So I knew I could do it, and I knew that coaching was like right for me, but the only avenues I saw were those. And then came February of 2019. I had just received a huge promotion, and I was now an administrator of several hospitals in the Austin area. I was going back and forth to several. And I was sitting in the parking lot of a hospital that I'd used to work at. I was going in as this new administrator. And Grief with Krista St. Germain was the podcast title. And I'm listening to it. And for the first time I'd ever been exposed to something that had normally been relegated to therapy and counseling, which is grief and loss. And you're talking about it from a coaching perspective. And it was like the clouds parted, the angels sang, and just me sitting in my white minivan on this uncharacteristically cold February morning in Austin, Texas, IVF This was born.
Oh, I love it.
So you are completely indirectly responsible for this amazing movement that we have where my only goal is to change how we talk about infertility. So thank you from me to you.
I'm so happy to hear that story and so honored to be part of that journey. And what's so fascinating is, for me, being on Brooke's podcast was such a full circle moment, right? Like I was that same, I mean, I knew her at that point, but just, because her podcast had changed my life so much. So the idea of this ripple effect that we can all have in coaching, and it just kind of blooms into the next area that would benefit and the next area that would benefit. So yeah, someday you're going to come back to me and somebody's going to have told you a story about how IVF This started their, their movement. Yeah,
absolutely.
I love it.
Yes. And being on Brooke's podcast is a bucket list goal that I have.
Yeah.
She's going to do an infertility panel. I just feel it. I just know it.
I love it.
Anyway, so enough about me. One of the things that you've talked about, and I do listen to your podcast, I have never experienced the loss of my husband. He's alive and well, but because so much of your work resonates with me, and one of the first episodes that I remember listening to was on post-traumatic growth. So that is such a beautiful experience and part of positive psychology, this positive psychology movement that started in early 1990s-ish. So can you tell us what is post-traumatic growth? What does it mean? All the things.
Yeah, I remember the first time I heard about it. I think at that point, I'd only heard about post-traumatic stress disorder, and it was kind of like the record scratch stop. You're like, post-traumatic what? Like, skirt, But it's just this idea. Well, not idea now. It's something that's been studied and has a strong amount of data behind it. But this idea that was discovered, I guess you could say, in the early 90s by a couple of researchers who were really able to uncover that instead of thinking of trauma as something we just have to get through, and the goal of, life post-trauma to be just to get back to normal functioning, that you actually could experience growth, right? That something traumatic could be the springboard to greater well-being. And so it really took us from thinking that the goal of, someone's life post-trauma was just to go back from this hole they were in to kind of level playing ground. And that actually, if we wanted to, we can take what's happened to us, which is highly subjective, of course. We call it trauma, and then use that as a way to bounce forward to increase our satisfaction, increase our well-being.
Yes. So good.
So kind of, for me, and for the women that I work with, and I'm assuming, probably a lot of the women that you work with, most of us are thinking, the best we can do is just cope, just get used to this, kind of crappy new normal
slog through
that we didn't ask for, right? Yeah. And so we really limit the idea of what's possible for us. And post-traumatic growth comes along and says, no, actually, you can use this if you want to. You can make your life better if you want to.
Yeah. A lot of my work is helping women to understand that infertility trauma is a real thing.
Yes.
Because I think our society and culture do a really great job of curating what trauma, quote unquote, trauma looks like.
Is.
Right. And so for many of us, I worked in trauma centers. That was one of my primary roles as a social worker. So my view of trauma was car accidents, gunshot wounds, stabbings, right? That was the lens through which I viewed trauma. And it wasn't until my mother, who is a clinical social worker, she was one of the pioneer members being trained in EMDR, eye movement desensitization.
Oh, yes, really?
She was trained in the very early 90s. I think I was like 6 or 7.
Wow.
Yeah, she's a remarkable one. She works with veterans now. And she's Bev Greiner, you're just amazing. But it wasn't until I had a conversation with her, this was probably after our first round of IVF. So we'd already gone through primary and secondary infertility. And I just in passing, I said, is it hard for you to see us go through this? And she, without missing a beat, she said, it's like any other trauma. It doesn't just affect the one person. It affects the entire family. We're social workers, so we talk about systems theory. It affects the entire system. And it literally wasn't until we had that conversation that I even viewed what we had experienced as trauma.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I think that's because, we're still living in that old paradigm of trauma being specific to the type of event, and that's how, when PTSD was originally introduced into the DSM, that's what it was thought to be, right? That post-traumatic stress disorder was caused by certain types of events, and those events were specific, as you were saying, right? And as that's evolved over time, we now know that trauma is highly subjective.
Yes.
What's traumatic for one is not necessarily traumatic for the other. And so it's much less about the actual event and much more about the individual's perception of the event.
Yes. I think it's important for everyone to know there is no objective measure for what constitutes and what does not constitute trauma. If we just plainly say that. Because while I have experienced what we call a failed transfer, so an embryo transfer that did not result in a pregnancy, it was incredibly traumatic for me. But for someone who maybe that was not a trauma, and I have never experienced a miscarriage, that is incredibly traumatic for many other people. So I love that you talk about how subjective it is, because that it's totally the case. Nobody gets to tell you what is and what is not trauma.
Yes. I love that you said that. Nobody gets to tell you. Yeah.
And you brought up PTSD. And I think, again, because we think about things very much through the medical model of things. So do you have to be diagnosed with PTSD for post-traumatic growth?
Not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. No, not at all. Yeah. And so, you're really just kind of expanding the idea. First of all, I think is what you're saying is like, hey, we need to really consider maybe the way we've been defining trauma is a little bit limited, let's open that up. And then also we can open up who post-traumatic growth is available to, which is that anyone who wants to increase their well-being and has been through something that they perceive as traumatic has the capability, the potential, right? The wherewithal to increase their overall life satisfaction.
So good. I developed a concept that I introduced pretty early on in this podcast around compounded trauma. So it's different from the medical model of complex trauma, but it's kind of when you experience infertility and, every single month that you have your period when you don't want it, every single doctor's appointment, even just walking into the OB's office and seeing all these pregnant women can be a traumatic experience. And so what could look on the surface to other people as relatively minor or insignificant even events is actually creating this very large trauma blob that your brain is not able to file away.
Yes.
So that's one of my favorite things to talk about with my people.
Having no direct experience with this personally, but watching my nearest and dearest friend since middle school go through her own fertility issues, I have seen how every Facebook post of someone's, announcement, every shower, every time it seems like someone in her world who doesn't want a baby gets pregnant.
Yes.
Right? The trauma blob. really accurate description. Even just, recently she's discovered she's got a cyst and she's going to have a hysterectomy. And so just watching that whole over, the past 20 years of her life, because we're in our mid 40s, the cumulative impact of all of those little events has been really significant in her life.
Yeah. And I don't know that women going through infertility give themselves enough credit for the stuff that because you're right. It seems like everybody, the moment you decide to have a kid and you have some trouble, everyone and their dog is pregnant. I can't tell you how many times people have said, well, we weren't even trying.
Yes.
My sisters-in-law, who I adore them both, they're the type of people who get pregnant just by folding underwear. Like, no problems whatsoever.
Yep. Sneeze.
Yep.
Pregnant.
We got another one.
Yep. Congratulations.
Yeah. And, it took me a long time of self-coaching and being exposed to coaching to get to a point where I can laugh about that because, if we even rewind 5 years, that would be such a point of pain for me.
Yes.
And that is like, that's the reason I'm doing all of this, because for one less woman to hurt the way that I did, God, that's worth everything, right?
Yeah. And it is grief. I mean, right? Like, I think we also need to loosen up our idea of what we think grief is, because this falls under that umbrella too, for sure.
Yeah. And there's a cyclical pattern with the grieving, because, your grief can come up or trauma can come up just by going to, this happened to me, that's why I know, but just going to Target and walking by the baby or maternity section like this. I had what's called a grief burst. So kind of where for anyone who's listening who doesn't know, it's where the grief just kind of comes out of nowhere. You're blindsided, hit by a truck, and all of a sudden, like me, you're crying in the Target parking lot because it's 2 days before Christmas. You were, quote unquote, supposed to be pregnant because the transfer was supposed to have worked. And this was like this was the only Christmas I was going to be pregnant because everything else was a summer baby. And so it just, it really is, we do need to open up our thoughts and our understanding of what grief looks like, what trauma looks like, because it's a totally different world that we live in now. And it's not, the strict criterion of the DSM, whatever edition, I know it's 5 now, but whatever edition at the time, because there is so much more complexity and dynamic interactions and experiences in our world now.
Yeah. Yeah. And even if, I just think this is where I see most people that I work with struggle, even if some of what we're talking about is common knowledge to people who support others, or in supportive mental health care, working type roles, it might be common knowledge to them, but it is definitely not common knowledge to most of us growing up. We're not really taught about how to support ourselves. We're not taught about grief. We're not taught about trauma. We certainly haven't heard of, post-traumatic growth. Most of us have just no foundation for how to support ourselves in situations like this.
Right. I mean, we're not taught about feelings, period. Right?
True story.
Math, science, reading, writing, and just do what you can with your feelings. Just shove those bad boys down.
Right. Power through, power through.
Story of my life.
Yeah.
Now, when we talk about post-traumatic growth, are there areas where you see or experience recurring themes of post-traumatic growth?
Yeah, there are basically 5. I don't know that we could, in my work, that I necessarily would limit them to 5, but most of what you would read if you were interested in researching post-traumatic growth is you would find 5 kind of key areas. So greater appreciation for life, right? So you realize how short life can be, how precious life is, and you develop a greater appreciation for being alive. Increased satisfaction in the quality of your relationships with other people, right? So you start valuing other people and you value your relationships with them more. It can open you up to new possibilities of life. Definitely, that's what happened for me, right? Where I realized not only is life short, but I don't think, as you said, I don't really think I want to be in aerospace. I don't want to work with planes for the rest of my life, which is what I was doing before. What are the possibilities for my life going forward? And can I step into a greater possibility? So that's number 3. Then just increase personal strength, right? Like learning that we are resilient and and increasing our sense of personal strength, and then spiritual connection.
Yes.
Spiritual change. So for different people, of course, that means different things, but just really reevaluating what is important to you spiritually and deepening often a connection or your own spiritual ideas.
Yes. I think for a lot of my people, what we realize is our inner strength, but also the lengths that we're willing to go. You know, if you had asked me 4 or 5 years ago, what lengths would I would be willing to go, I don't think that I would have mentioned giving myself over 180 injections. Like, that's not something that most people think about, but it is a reality of IVF. Like that's a very typical cycle. And so either receiving 180 injections over the course of, 6 weeks or giving them yourself, because I'm a little bit of a control freak. So I love my husband and I trust him, but I was like, I'm going to do that.
I'm doing it myself.
That's right. But yeah, and I think that framing while you're in the midst of your trauma, that is part of your growth. Understanding the lengths of what you would be willing to do for this dream that you have of a family. I think that offers more empowerment while you're going through it, because it does feel like a little bit of a slog and you feel like a pincushion.
I can only imagine 180 pounds.
It's a lot of fun. 0 out of 0 recommend.
Your idea of fun, Emily, I don't know. It's questionable.
It is a little suspect. But yeah, I think even just that simple reframe of learning your own resilience and learning the lengths at which you're willing to go for your dream is a beautiful experience.
Yeah. And sometimes I think we don't give ourselves enough credit for that. I know this happens a lot with widows where people are telling them, "Oh, you're so strong," and their natural response is like, "Not really." It's not like I really had a choice. I didn't ask for this, and it's not really an option for me to give up. But sometimes I wish we would really consider that. No, actually, it is an option. It is an option to just never get out of bed.
Yes. Yeah.
And some people actually do that, right? And so let's take credit, even if it doesn't feel great, and even if, it's not what we asked for, that no matter what the struggle is, that it is a choice to still put one foot in front of the other. It is a choice to still, keep going and keep focusing on what we can control. And so to discredit that, I think, is a missed opportunity. I see a lot of my women doing that.
I completely agree. I think my people also get kind of lost in that, well, we don't have a choice. We have to do this. And yeah, we get told, I don't know how you do that. I don't know how you go through that.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel like a compliment. I think you talked about that on your podcast one time. It doesn't feel like a compliment when someone is like, I can't believe you've been through this, but it is. And it's the opportunity for us to give ourselves credit for where we've come.
Yeah. Give ourselves a compliment and say, "Hey, good job, you." This is hard and you're still going.
Right? Yeah.
And this is not what you planned. It's not what you envisioned. And proud of you. Yeah. Love you.
Damn it. You got this.
Damn it. You're resilient. AF. Yeah. Yeah.
And one thing that's really interesting about infertility is there's still a lot of question marks, particularly around the emotional implications of infertility. There's really only a handful of studies that talk about primary infertility and secondary infertility. So primary, for any of you listening who don't know that, primary infertility is 12 months of continued unprotected sex without achieving a pregnancy. And secondary infertility is the same amount of time, but having already achieved a pregnancy.
Okay. Thank you.
So either one of those, there was a specific study that was done that used a previous medical framework for gauging PTSD as it relates to women who reported primary and secondary infertility. And what was reported just in that one study was that women who have experienced either primary or secondary infertility had a 46% higher likelihood of self-reported PTSD than the general population.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Did it surprise you?
Not even a little bit. No. I was actually kind of shocked that the number was lower than I expected. I think I expected a higher number, but it's not like, because of how society and culture curate this view of trauma, I don't think we give credit for what we've experienced as trauma.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah. And I think also too, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm making some assumptions just, based on what I've watched my best friend go through. It's so isolating. It has been so isolating for her because, I know what's happening because we talk. And, maybe some of her closer family members know what's happening because they talk. But really, if you were an outsider in her life or someone not so close to her, you wouldn't see the pain. You wouldn't see the suffering. It looks from the outsider's perspective like everything's fine.
Yes.
And
it's invisible scars is kind of what we talk about.
Yeah. Whereas you lose your husband, it's a little obvious, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing invisible about that for most of, depending on the loss, but for most losses, like a death loss, everybody understands. You get a little more support socially. It's different.
Yeah. When I talked about grief, I've talked about grief a couple of times in my podcast, but there aren't really any rituals like a ceremonies or anything like that that's associated with infertility and miscarriage. With infant loss or something like that, you do tend to get the burials and those type of rituals, but not with infertility. Like me personally, I had a very large cyst on my ovary and I had to have that ovary removed. And I mourned and grieved because there's a lot of shame that's wrapped up in infertility. But there was no you told someone, oh, I had a surgery and I had my ovary removed. Unless you're in that community, it was like, oh, so you're telling me you basically had like your appendix removed or something? Like, not because that person was being insensitive, but just because the weight of it isn't known. It's like, unless it's you're the front row of that funeral or, it's your person or something like that, you don't really know it.
Makes sense.
So even though there's limited budding research around infertility trauma, I guess the point is I want to make sure that we drive home. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist just because there's only, 6 peer-reviewed journals or something like that. How do people go from this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me to maybe not like this is the best thing to ever happen to me, but maybe there is a blessing in the disguise of this?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we have to be careful when we talk about that, because I know what I never want people to hear is you should find the silver lining, right? You should find the blessing. And so I think a lot of people come to me with that and they're shooting on themselves and it's just damaging and not at all helpful. And so we have to know that it's an option, no matter what we go through in life, to separate what we can't control from what we can, and then decide who we want to be in the face of what we can't control. And so I like to think about it a little more like that, right? So, okay, here's this part of my life that is not going the way that I expected. And there are certain things that I can do to try and influence that, but to some extent, there are certain aspects of it that are out of my control. How do I know the difference? Right. So for me, husband died, out of my control, happened in the past. I can't control that. And now I don't have to pretend it was great and I'm happy about it.
Right.
But I do get to decide what I want to do with it, who I want to be in the face of it, and if I want to let it limit my overall satisfaction in life.
Yep.
And that's how I see it being. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of us do crave that silver lining. But for me, I just want my people to, again, recognize what they can and cannot control, but then you don't have to be an asshole to yourself through the process.
Yes.
Like, if there's anything that I'm taking from this conversation, it's compassion and give yourself credit.
Yes.
If we could just do those two things, our life would change in such a fundamental way, whether you bring home that baby or not.
Yes. Yeah. And then I think part of that too is also it's this constant choice to accept what is, in terms of, okay, this is the part I can't control and I'm going to accept that I can't control that. And because I accept it, I stop spending my energy trying to control something I can't, which then better positions me to put that same energy towards something I can control or influence. And that keeps me feeling less like a victim, more powerful, right? And it keeps me spending my energy in a way that has me creating life on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
When we have a really deep story about how life is supposed to go and it doesn't go that way.
I think that's probably one of the predominant things when people start experiencing infertility is that like, no, you're just supposed to like decide with your partner, this is what we're doing. And then, 3, maybe 6 months, I'll give it 6 months to see. And then it's supposed to happen. And, I talk to so many women who just literally just admitting that they are going to seek fertility treatments is a huge step because it just flies in the face of everything we've expected, that expected life course, that expected parenting course of our life to be like. And so arguing with reality is a big thing that I talk about with my people because it's like, yeah, we can't do anything about, like, I can't grow a new ovary. I wish I could. And I can't fix my husband's sperm. We're an overachieving couple. We have male and female factor infertility. It's just how we do it. Thank you.
It's how we roll here.
That's right. We go big or go home. We live in Texas.
Yes.
And so, I can't fix those things. But what can I do? I can be the best mother for the children that I have right now. I can work on my mind and manage my thoughts, manage my emotions, and produce content and learn more to help other people. And so that's been a big part of my post-traumatic growth, even though until I was introduced to you, I didn't really know that's what I was doing. So I love that at least, for anyone who's listening, you might have already started to reach out and be like a peer support or something like that. And let's put a name to it. Let's give yourself some credit. Like you are growing from this in a beautiful way. So I always close with, do you have any strategies or suggested resources if anyone is interested in post-traumatic growth or anything like that?
I don't think it's necessary to go out and read all the books. I mean, you can just do a Google search on post-traumatic growth and you'll see, Tedeschi and Calhoun's work and, there's a lot since then. So there's interesting things out there. There's interesting workbooks out there, but really, I don't think any of that is so necessary as much as it is just understanding, again, kind of what we were talking about earlier, constantly looking and increasing your awareness to the point, which it's really helpful if you have a coach to do this with, of what you can control and what you can't. And then not just accepting your brain's story about what that means, right? But really increasing your awareness so that you can see that your brain has a story about why this is doomsday for your life. And then if you don't like what that story is creating, then choosing to tell a different story.
Right.
And so I'm going to suggest coaching every time, because even though I think there are some, useful workbooks and things that are kind of self-directed out there, I don't think there's anything like having a coach to help you see, because this is where we all get so stuck. We are so in our story because it's our story. It's like being a fish in water. You ask the fish how the water is, and the fish has no concept that it's even in water because it's just always been in water. And it's so hard when it's your life and your story to even see that it's a story.
Right.
And if you, and that's why I think to have an extra set of eyes and a different perspective on your life from that just coaching lens is really necessary in order to increase your awareness. So you can see, actually, I'm not my story. Just because my brain has a story doesn't mean I have to tolerate it, listen to it, resign myself to it. I am the author of my life. I do get to write my own story, and maybe I can't change the past, but I'm definitely in charge of the present, and I'm definitely in charge of, how I choose to think and show up in the future. And so every time I'm going to recommend coaching.
Well, and I do appreciate that on a coaching podcast.
I might be a little biased, but it's the reason I was able to change my life. And I'm not knocking any other, option out there, but just being able to really learn how to see my thoughts as thoughts and realize that actually my life doesn't have to go the way I thought it was going to go for me to love it.
Right. I think one of the most revelatory moments of my life was the first time I was coached. And I think we were 2 minutes in and she goes, "Do you realize that's a thought, right?"
And you're like,
I don't know. Feels
Say
real
what?
true.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
you know, you just pull, what's the phrase? Pull the thread and the whole sweater unveils or something.
Sweater. Yeah.
Yep. And so that was, that was the reason that I was like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah.
Similar to you. So thank you for sharing that. Since we're on the topic of post-traumatic growth, one of my favorite, and I think you've referenced his work in the past too, Viktor Frankl. If you've never read any of his books, this man is remarkable. He was in a concentration camp during World War II. And he's written 3-4 books.
Yeah.
Yeah, something. They're all incredible. But my favorite quote from him, which I think speaks volumes to what we're talking about, is when we are no longer able to change the situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And he wrote this in reference to forgiveness and acceptance of what he had experienced while being imprisoned in a concentration camp. So if there's anyone who's ever grown and thrived after one of the most traumatic experiences that we can even fathom, it is that man. So I would highly recommend his work.
It's so interesting that you would pick that quote, because I remember how inspiring that quote was for me after Hugo died, right? Because that was exactly where I found myself and thinking, okay, yeah, I can't change this situation. I can't, but I think I can figure out how to change myself and the way I'm responding to it.
I ran across that quote. So anger is one of my favorite emotions to it's one of my most familiar emotions to just grab onto as quickly as possible. And I was so angry during our primary infertility. And I had just finished my master's in social work. So I was still kind of in this world of reading all the things and still very academic. And someone had, I think my father actually had recommended Viktor Frankl. And I came across that quote and I was like, damn, that means, maybe I don't have to be angry all of the time.
Yeah.
And it was just literally just that tiny shift that changed things for me.
Was that hard for you when, like, did you have a moment or more moments than maybe a moment where you kind of got annoyed with that idea?
Always.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. not a singular annoyance. No. In fact, I find that every phase of my growth includes a level of annoyance. Like, son of a, come on.
Yeah, I think and the reason I ask that is because I'm just imagining, it's easy for us now because this is the work that we do. And I just think so if I'm imagining listeners that might hear that and go, you know what, screw you. Like,
yeah,
I just kind of like resent the whole idea that I can't change the situation and that I have to change myself. And so I think that's just a common part of it.
Oh, totally.
And and so if that's your response, I hear
Welcome
you.
to the club.
It sounds like you've been there. Yeah. And it doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. And it also doesn't mean that you still can't, if you want to, at a certain point, lean in to that idea of changing yourself, even if you're not ready for it now. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Kicking and screaming, holding on to all of my anger, all of my resentment every time.
You can't take my anger and resentment from me.
Don't do it. Don't even think about it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Krista, so much for joining us on the podcast today. I cannot tell you how much it means to me personally, but also I know what it means to my people listening. So thank you very much.
100% my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. All right, guys. Thank you so much. I'll talk to you later. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.